Hey folks, and we are back with the fourth episode of the series that we are calling the Architects of Prosperity here on Site Selectors Are People Too. So to start this off, think about the classic border war in economic development. You know the one. Your state creates a massive new incentive package, not to attract a new foreign direct investment project from overseas, but specifically to lure a corporate headquarters 3 miles across the state line. The company doesn't create any net new jobs, they're just moving their existing workforce to a shiny new office park. You issue a press release claiming a massive victory. The neighboring state issues a press release condemning your predatory tactics. It is the ultimate zero-sum game. For you to win, someone else had to lose. The size of the economic pie didn't change, you just grabbed a bigger slice for your own political jurisdiction. For 200 years, this zero-sum warfare wasn't just a localized tactic, it was the undisputed operating system of the entire global economy. It was called, as we learned earlier, mercantilism, and it was built on the belief that a nation's wealth was finite, measured only by the gold in its vaults. But then the system broke, not because of a war, not because of a technological disruption. It was dismantled by a profound intellectual pivot led by a Scottish philosopher and an English stockbroker. Today, we are looking at the intellectual revolution that birthed modern capitalism, free trade, and globalization. We are going to explore how we learned to stop hoarding gold and started growing the pie. I'm your host, Devin Hillsdon-Smith, and you're listening to Site Selectors Are People Too. As I mentioned before, this is episode 4 of our special miniseries, The Architects of Prosperity, and this episode is called The Classical Revolution. Let's get into it. All right, everybody. Before we unpack the birth of liberal economics, a quick word from today's sponsor. Yes, you guessed it, Strategies. In the economic development game, it's incredibly easy to get caught up in zero-sum thinking, stealing a project from a rival rather than growing your own organic ecosystem. But as we'll learn today, building your economic future on structural growth rather than extraction is the only way to win long-term. That's where Strategies comes in. Strategies is a premier advisory firm that helps communities and corporate leaders bridge the gap between bold vision and ground-level reality. Whether you're navigating a complex site selection matrix, developing a resilient workforce pipeline, or trying to understand your true comparative advantage, Hyphen gives you the clear-eyed, data-driven roadmap you need to close the deal. Stop fighting over the same slice of the pie, and let Strategies help you grow the bakery. Visit www.strategiesllc.com to learn how we can help your team connect the dots. All right, let's head to Scotland. I want you to picture the year 1776. For most of us listening, that year triggers a very specific, very loud set of historical images. It's the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It's George Washington crossing the Delaware. It's the birth of a new political republic built on the radical idea that people should govern themselves. It was loud, it was violent, and it was entirely focused on political liberty. But 3,000 miles away across the Atlantic Ocean in a quiet, sleepy coastal town called Kirkcaldy in Scotland, a much quieter revolution was taking place. There were no muskets. There were no grand speeches in a crowded hall. There was just a middle-aged, notoriously absent-minded professor walking along the beach, talking to himself, and writing a book. His name was Adam Smith. He was a moral philosopher. He was the kind of guy who was so deep in his own thoughts that he once supposedly walked 15 miles out of town in his dressing gown before realizing where he was. He wasn't a swashbuckling financial rogue like John Law from our last episode. He wasn't a politician. He was just a guy who spent a decade sitting in his study trying to answer one foundational, seemingly mundane question. Why are some places rich and other places poor? In 1776, after 10 years of obsessive drafting, he published his answer. It was a massive, dense, sprawling book titled An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. Today we just call it The Wealth of Nations. And we call Adam Smith the father of modern economics. But here is the thing that often gets left out of the textbooks. Adam Smith didn't invent these ideas in a vacuum. He was the product of a very specific time and place. You see, Smith was part of something called the Scottish Enlightenment. In the mid-1700s, Scotland, specifically Edinburgh, was arguably the intellectual capital of the world. It was a place where brilliant minds gathered to question literally everything about human existence. And Smith's best friend was a man named David Hume. David Hume was a titan of philosophy. He was a skeptic, an empiricist, and a man who loved to poke holes in accepted dogma. Hume had already begun to challenge the economic status quo. He looked at the British government's obsession with hoarding gold and artificially manipulating trade balances, and he realized it was mathematically flawed. Hume taught Adam Smith to look past the political rhetoric of the king and look at the actual data. But the real turning point for Smith, the moment the pieces of modern capitalism actually fell into place, didn't happen in Scotland. It happened on a road trip to, France. Over a decade earlier, in 1764, Smith took a highly lucrative job as a private tutor to a young British duke. They traveled to Paris, and there, Smith was introduced to a radical group of French thinkers who called themselves the Physiocrats. The Physiocrats were led by a man named Francois Quesnay. Now, Quesnay, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, was not a banker. He was actually the consulting physician to King Louis XV at the Palace of Versailles. Because he was a doctor, he viewed the economy like a human body. He believed that money was the blood and trade was the circulatory system. If the government put up tariffs and blocked trade, it was like putting a tourniquet on an arm. Eventually, the limb dies. Quesnay even drew a literal diagram of this, mapping how money flowed between farmers, merchants, and the state. But the Physiocrats' most massive breakthrough, the idea that set Adam Smith's brain on fire, was their definition of wealth. Remember, at this time, the world was dominated by mercantilism. Mercantilism believed that wealth was measured strictly by the amount of physical gold and silver sitting in a national vault. This was called bullionism. The Physiocrats looked at France, which was starving and bankrupt despite having massive gold reserves in Versailles, and they said, the mercantilists are completely wrong. You cannot eat gold. You cannot build a house out of silver. The physiocrats argued that true wealth comes from the earth. It comes from agriculture. A nation is wealthy if it produces an abundance of wheat, corn, livestock, and timber. Adam Smith heard this, and it was a revelation. The physiocrats were right. Wealth isn't shiny metal, it's tangible goods. But Smith realized the French doctor hadn't gone quite far enough. He thought only farm labor created wealth. Smith looked at the booming textile mills of Britain, the blacksmiths, the shipbuilders, and he realized the ultimate truth. Wealth isn't just agriculture. Wealth is all productive human labor. It is the total productive capacity of the economy. It's the annual produce of its land and labor. Smith essentially invented the concept of gross domestic product, GDP, more than a century before the term existed. This was a world-altering conclusion because it destroyed the great monster of the 18th century, the finite pie fallacy. If you are a mercantilist king and you think wealth is a fixed amount of gold, your entire worldview is zero-sum. If you want a bigger slice of the pie, you can't bake a new pie. You have to take a slice from France or Spain or the Netherlands. Trade isn't a mutually beneficial exchange. It's a weapon of war. You ban imports, you subsidize exports, and you colonize entire continents just to strip mine their resources. And if we strip away the galleons and the musket fire, this is the exact same psychology that drives the worst parts of the modern economic development industry today. Think about the classic border war we talked about in the teaser. A governor wants a political win, so you put together a $100 million tax abatement package just to bribe a corporate headquarters to move 3 miles across the state line. You didn't create any net new jobs. The regional economy didn't produce any new goods. The pie didn't get bigger. You just grabbed your neighbor's slice, hoarded it in your vault, and issued a press release claiming you grew the economy. It's a zero-sum game that wastes public resources for the illusion of growth. Adam Smith, you see, took the insights of David Hume and the French physiocrats, and he proved that this entire system was a destructive fallacy. If wealth is just the stuff we make, then the pie is not finite. If we can figure out how to make more stuff with the same amount of effort, the pie gets bigger. Britain can get richer without France getting poorer. It is a positive sum game. So, how do you do it? How do you unlock that massive surge in productivity? Smith's answer was the concept that built the modern industrialized world: specialization and the division of labor. To prove his point, Smith didn't use grand theories of statecraft. He used an incredibly boring everyday object. He used a pin. Just a tiny metal pin used for sewing clothes. Smith asks the reader to imagine an untrained worker trying to make a metal pin from scratch. Now, think about what that actually entails. You have to mine the metal. You have to smelt it. You have to draw out the wire. You have to straighten the wire. You have to cut it to the exact length. You have to sharpen the point. You have to grind the top to receive the head. You have to forge the tiny metal head and then carefully attach it to the shaft. If one lone guy in a workshop tries to do all of that by himself, switching tools every 5 seconds, losing his momentum, trying to be a master of 18 different micro skills? How many pins do you think he makes in a day? Smith guessed maybe 1, maybe 20 if he worked himself to the bone. Now, Smith says, let's look at a proper modern pin factory. In the factory, the labor is divided. One man only draws the wire. All day long, he just draws wire. He becomes incredibly fast and efficient at it. A second man only straightens it. A third only cuts it. A fourth only points it. A fifth is grinding the top. Smith noted that the task of making a pin is divided into about 18 distinct operations. And what is the result? Smith observed a small factory of just 10 men because they divided the labor, because they specialized, because they didn't have to stop and switch tools. Those 10 men didn't produce 200 pins a day. They produced 48,000 pins in a single day. That is nearly 5,000 pins per person, from 20 to 5,000, simply by reorganizing the way human beings work together. This is the core of modern economic development. When we talk today about industry clusters, when we talk about building a supply chain ecosystem around an electric vehicle battery plant, what we are really trying to do is build Adam Smith's pin factory on a regional scale. We are trying to group specialized labor and specialized suppliers together so the whole region becomes exponentially more productive. Adam Smith had found the key to growing the pie. He proved that human labor, properly organized, could generate unimaginable wealth. But as Smith looked away from the factory floor and up toward the halls of Parliament, he realized a dark truth. The wealth was being generated, but it was being siphoned off. The government, heavily influenced by massive, state-sponsored corporate monopolies, was actively rigging the rules of the game to prevent this new wealth from ever reaching the consumer. When we come back, Adam Smith takes on the most powerful corporation in history and introduces the most misunderstood phrase in all of economics. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Architects of Prosperity. Before the break, we saw how Adam Smith used a simple pin factory to blow up the finite pie fallacy. He proved that wealth isn't hoarded gold, it is the productive capacity of human labor. But Smith wasn't just an academic theorist looking at factory floors with rose-colored glasses. He was a deeply cynical, sharp-eyed observer of political power. And he realized that proving the pie could grow didn't matter if the political system was actively designed to siphon off that growth before it ever reached the average person. Smith used The Wealth of Nations to expose the deep, rot-level political corruption of the mercantilist state. He looked at the global economy of his day and realized it was effectively a rigged casino. Let's think back to our last episode. Remember John Law and the Mississippi Company in France? Remember the South Sea Company in Britain? These were massive state-granted monopolies. The government literally outlawed competition so these single entities could control entire hemispheres of trade. Smith attacked this protectionism relentlessly. He looked at the embargoes, the massive tariffs, and these monopolies, and he called them out for exactly what they were. He argued that these mercantilist policies choked off international trade. But to really understand Adam Smith's furious critique of crony capitalism, we have to look at the ultimate villain of his book. We have to look at the largest, most powerful, and most destructive corporation in human history, the British East India Company. Today, when we think of a monopoly, we think of a tech company that controls too much market share in search engines, or a telecom company that's the only internet provider in a rural county. The British East India Company wasn't just a business, it was a militarized corporate state. By the time Adam Smith was writing his book in the 1770s, the East India Company had its own private army. And I don't mean a security force, I mean an army of over 250,000 soldiers. They had a military force twice the size of the actual British National Army. They conquered the Indian subcontinent. They collected their own taxes, minted their own coins, and effectively ruled over millions of people as a publicly traded corporation. But here is the absolute craziest part, and the part that drove Adam Smith insane. Despite having a total monopoly on trade with half the globe, the East India Company was terribly managed. They were corrupt, they were bloated, and by 1772, they were facing massive financial collapse. They had a huge surplus of tea sitting in warehouses in London, and they were staring at bankruptcy. So, what did this massive corporation do? They went to the British Parliament, where many of the politicians just so happened to own shares in the company, and they asked for a bailout, the original too big to fail. The British government passed the Tea Act of 1773. This act essentially bailed out the East India Company by allowing them to dump their surplus tea onto the American colonies at a massively subsidized rate, undercutting all the local American merchants. And how the American colonists react to this blatant act of corporate cronyism? They marched onto the ships in Boston Harbor and threw the East India Company's tea into the harbor. Adam Smith was writing The Wealth of Nations exactly as the American Revolution was kicking off. He saw firsthand that this mercantilist system of state-sponsored monopolies wasn't just economically inefficient, it was literally tearing the British Empire apart. He called the East India Company a gang of plunderers. Smith looked at this entire system and declared it a fraud upon the public. For 200 years, politicians claimed that heavy tariffs and monopolies were in the national interest. The argument was always, we have to protect British jobs. We have to protect British industries. Smith looked at the data and said, no, this does not serve the national interest. It serves the special interests of a very small part of the public. Namely, it served the wealthy merchants, the elite manufacturers, and the corporate board members who had the coercion and political means to lobby the government for protection from competition. In modern economic theory, we have a very specific term for this. We call it rent-seeking behavior. Rent-seeking is when a company or an individual tries to increase their own wealth without actually creating any new wealth or value for society. They do it by manipulating the political and regulatory environment. If you're an economic developer, you see this all the time at the local level. Imagine a powerful local real estate developer who owns a massive, slightly outdated industrial park. Instead of investing his own money to upgrade his facilities, repair the roofs, and install fiber optic cables to attract tenants, he goes to the city council. He lobbies them to change the zoning laws so that no new industrial parks can be built within a 20-mile radius. He doesn't make his product better. He didn't lower his prices. He didn't innovate. He just used the government to make it illegal for anyone to compete with him. Now, site selectors have no choice but to lease his outdated buildings at a premium. That is rent-seeking. And Adam Smith realized that the entire global economy of the 1700s was built on it. In place of this mercantilist cronyism, Adam Smith proposed a radical alternative. He called for a system of natural liberty built on enlightened self-interest. And this brings us to what is easily the most famous and the most aggressively misunderstood concept in the history of economics: the invisible hand. If you watch Wall Street movies or you listen to certain politicians, you will hear the invisible hand used as a blanket excuse for Gordon Gekko-style greed is good capitalism. People use it to argue that corporations should be allowed to do whatever they want, dump chemicals in the river, and exploit workers because the invisible hand will magically sort it all out. But that is absolutely not what Adam Smith meant. Smith argued that if individuals were free to pursue their own profit, an invisible hand would counterintuitively guide them to produce exactly what society needed, benefiting the community as a whole. But the invisible hand is not magic. It is simply a description of decentralized price signaling. Imagine a baker. The baker doesn't wake up at 4 a.m. to bake bread because he is a saint. He doesn't do it out of charity. He does it because he wants to make money to feed his own family. He is acting in self-interest. But, and this is a massive critical caveat, the only way that baker can make money is if he bakes bread that the town actually wants to eat and sells it at a price the town can afford. If his bread tastes like cardboard, or if he charges $50 a loaf, his customers will just walk across the street to the other baker. In pursuing his own selfish profit, he is invisibly guided to serve the community. The town gets fed, the baker gets paid. It is a positive sum game. But for the invisible hand to work, Smith said it requires one absolute non-negotiable condition: free competition. The moment that baker bribes the mayor to shut down all the other bakeries in town, the invisible hand dies. Without competition, there is no price signaling. Without competition, there is just a monopoly, and the monopoly will always exploit the consumer. Smith was actually deeply suspicious of business owners. He explicitly warned that the government must maintain a limited but firm role in preventing monopolies from forming. Ultimately, Smith's critique of the state casino was not just technical, it was deeply moral. He sought to recenter the entire purpose of economics. For the mercantilists, the economy served the state. The citizens were just pawns, taxpayers meant to generate revenue for the king's endless geopolitical wars. For Adam Smith, the economy must serve the individual consumer. He redefined the very goal of human society as the well-being of the individual, not the geopolitical power of the sovereign. It was the birth of liberal economics. Smith proved that inside a country, free markets and competition grow the pie. But the classical revolution wasn't finished, because 40 years later, someone had to figure out how to apply these rules across international borders, especially when the playing field was completely uneven. When we come back, an English stockbroker bets his entire fortune on the Battle of Waterloo and takes Adam Smith's theories to create the mathematical equation that built modern globalization. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Architects of Prosperity on Site Selectors Are People Too. Before the break, we watched Adam Smith dismantle the mercantilist state casino. Smith proved that free markets and competition, guided by the invisible hand, serve the consumer better than state-sponsored monopolies. But Adam Smith had a bit of a blind spot. You see, Smith's theories worked flawlessly when you were looking at the internal economy of a single country. And they even made intuitive sense for international trade, as long as you were talking about what we call absolute advantage. Absolute advantage is pretty easy to understand. Let's say France has the perfect climate and soil for growing grapes, so they are the best in the world at making wine. England has terrible weather for grapes, but they have great pastures for sheep, so they are the absolute best at making wool. Smith said, this is a no-brainer. France should specialize in wine, England should specialize in wool, and they should trade. Both get richer. But what happens when the playing field is entirely uneven? What happens if one country is just better at making everything? Let's say France is better at making wine and they are better at making wool. A mercantilist would look at that and say, well, France shouldn't buy anything from England. England should make both, hoard its wealth, and England is just out of luck. England needs to throw up massive tariffs and close its borders to protect its inferior domestic industries. Even Adam Smith struggled to completely refute that logic. It took 40 years and a man named David Ricardo to finally break the code. If Adam Smith was the absent-minded philosopher walking on the beach, David Ricardo was the ultimate insider. He was an English political economist, but more importantly, he was a brilliant, cutthroat London stockbroker. He didn't think in broad moral philosophies. He thought in tight, rigorous mathematical models. And Ricardo wasn't just an armchair theorist. He was a man who put his money where his math was. In 1815, the entire continent of Europe was holding its breath. The Battle of Waterloo was happening. Napoleon Bonaparte was facing off against the British Duke of Wellington. The outcome of this single battle would determine the future of the global economy. If Napoleon won, the British Empire might collapse. On the London Stock Exchange, panic set in. British government bonds were plummeting. Everyone was selling. But David Ricardo looked at his information, ran the probabilities, and made one of the greatest, most audacious trades in financial history. While everyone else was panic selling, Ricardo bought. He bet his entire massive fortune on British government bonds, knowing that if Wellington defeated Napoleon, the value of those bonds would absolutely skyrocket. Well, he was right. Wellington won. The bonds soared. Ricardo made an astronomical sum of money, effectively retiring as one of the richest men in Britain. With his newly minted millions, he bought a massive country estate, and he did what any self-respecting, hyper-competitive genius would do. He bought himself a seat in the British Parliament so he could rewrite the laws of the global economy. In 1817, Ricardo published his masterwork on the principles of political economy and taxation. In it, he refined Adam Smith's theories and introduced what is still widely regarded today as one of the most powerful and most counterintuitive insights in the history of economics. It's called the theory of comparative advantage. Ricardo's profound insight was that absolute advantage actually doesn't matter when it comes to trade. What matters is comparative advantage. And comparative advantage is determined by a concept that every single economic developer and site selector needs to understand down to their bones: opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is simply the cost of producing one good measured in terms of the other goods you have to give up to make it. It's the productivity you lose by choosing one path over another. To prove this, Ricardo used a remarkably simple exercise or example. And I want you to stick with me through the math here, because understanding this specific equation is the key to understanding the entire foundation of modern globalization. Imagine, if you will, a highly simplified world. There are only two countries, Portugal and England, and there are only two goods in the entire world: wine and cloth. Here's the setup. Portugal is a powerhouse. They have an absolute advantage in both goods. Their workers are simply more efficient across the board. Now here comes the math, folks. Stick with me. We've got this. To produce 1 unit of wine, it takes a Portuguese worker 80 hours. It takes an English worker 120 hours. To produce 1 unit of cloth, it takes a Portuguese worker 90 hours. It takes an English worker 100 hours. So, Portugal beats England in both categories. The mercantilist says Portugal should close its borders, make its own wine, make its own cloth, and let England starve. But Ricardo says, hold on. Let's look at the opportunity cost. In England, if you want to make 1 unit of cloth, it takes 100 hours. If you take those 100 hours and apply them to making wine instead, which takes 120 hours per unit, you could only make a fraction of a unit of wine. Specifically, $100 divided by $120. Or pounds, I guess. Sorry. So in England, the opportunity cost of making 1 unit of cloth is 83 cents, or 83 units of wine. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. The opportunity cost of making 1 unit of cloth is 0.83 units of wine. There we go. Every time you make cloth, you give up 0.83 units of wine. Now look at Portugal. In Portugal, cloth takes 90 hours. Wine takes 80 hours. If Portugal decides to spend 90 hours making a unit of cloth, they are giving up the chance to make wine. 90 divided by 80 is 1.125. So in Portugal, the opportunity cost of making 1 unit of cloth is 1.125 units of wine. Here is the counterintuitive genius of David Ricardo. 0.83 is less than 1.125. Because England sacrifices less wine to make cloth than Portugal does, England has a lower opportunity cost. Therefore, England has the comparative advantage in cloth, because its relative disadvantage is the smallest. Portugal, conversely, has the comparative advantage in wine because its relative advantage is the largest. Ricardo proved with absolute mathematical certainty that if Portugal stops making cloth entirely and specializes 100% in wine, and if England stops making wine entirely and specializes 100% in cloth, then the two countries trade with each other. Both nations will be able to consume more of both goods than they could in a state of autarky. Autarky, probably pronounced horribly, is just the economic term for a closed, isolated economy. So let that sink in. Even though Portugal was faster and better at making cloth, it was economically irrational for them to make it. By wasting their time making cloth, they were giving up the massive, hyper-efficient gains they could be making in the wine sector. It was better for Portugal to buy cloth from the slower, less efficient English because it freed up Portuguese labor to do what they did absolutely best. This was not just a neat little whiteboard exercise for academics. This example of cloth and wine was the intellectual dynamite that blew up the old world. Ricardo's model provided the definitive, undeniable intellectual justification for 19th century globalization. It proved that protectionism and zero-sum trade wars don't just hurt your enemies, they mathematically impoverish your own citizens by forcing them to waste labor on inefficient industries. And this theory had massive, bloody political consequences. You see, for decades, Britain had suffered under something called the Corn Laws. The Corn Laws were heavy, mercantilist tariffs on imported grain. They were designed specifically to protect the domestic farming monopolies owned by the wealthy British aristocracy. But because they blocked cheap foreign food, they kept the price of bread artificially high, literally starving the working class people in the industrial cities. Armed with David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, a new wave of liberal politicians formed the Anti-Corn Law League. It was one of the first modern, highly organized political lobbying groups in history. They argued that Britain was an industrial powerhouse. Its comparative advantage was manufacturing, not farming. It was economically suicidal to starve factory workers just to enrich the land-owning lords. And so the debate raged for years, but it took a tragedy to force the issue. In 1845, the Irish potato famine struck. Millions were starving, and cheap foreign grain was desperately needed, but the Corn Laws blocked it from entering the country. The British Prime Minister, a man named Robert Peel, read Ricardo. He looked at the math of comparative advantage and he realized his own political party, the Conservative Party of the land-owning elite, was fundamentally wrong. In 1846, Robert Peel committed absolute political suicide. He betrayed his own party, aligned with the opposition, and fully repealed the Corn Laws. He obviously lost his job as Prime Minister shortly after, but he changed the world. Britain didn't negotiate a bilateral treaty. They didn't ask France or Germany for concessions. Based entirely on Ricardo's math, Britain unilaterally committed to a policy of free trade. They opened their ports to the world, trusting that specializing in their comparative advantage, industrial manufacturing, would make them wealthier than hiding behind tariff walls. And they were right. It launched the greatest period of sustained economic growth and global integration the world had ever seen up to that point. Now, when we come back, we'll wrap up the classical revolution and I'm going to show you how to take David Ricardo's 200-year-old math and use it to win your next site selection project. Be right back. All right, welcome back to the final segment of the Architects of Prosperity. As a side note, because this has been a bit denser of an episode, we're not going to have the final nerd section where the rest of you normal people leave. We're just going to end it where we end it. So this is going to be the slow roll into the end with our final segment. We've spent the last 40 minutes or so deep in the history books. We've hung out with Adam Smith in an 18th century pin factory, and we've watched David Ricardo bet his future on the Battle of Waterloo to prove the math of comparative advantage. But I promised you at the top of the show that this podcast isn't just history for the sake of history. So I am taking off the historian hat right now and I'm putting on the consultant hat. How does the classical revolution apply to us today? Why should an economic developer in Ohio or a site selector in Dallas care about a 200-year-old equation about Portuguese wine and English cloth? Because the ghost of mercantilism, that zero-sum, finite pie thinking, is still alive and well in our industry. Every time you see a community throw massive, irrational tax incentives at a project they have absolutely no business winning, just for the political vanity of beating a neighboring state, that is the finite pie fallacy at work. Every time a regional chamber of commerce decides they are going to build a biotech hub, a commercial aerospace cluster, and a semiconductor fabrication ecosystem all at the exact same time, despite having no existing workforce for any of them, that is a failure to understand opportunity cost. David Ricardo taught us that you cannot be the best at everything, and economically, you shouldn't even try. Economic development is not about copying whatever the hottest national trend is. Everyone wants to be the next Silicon Valley, kind of. Everyone wants an electric vehicle battery plant, kind of. But true economic development is about taking a hard, brutal, honest, data-driven look at your region and asking, what is our comparative advantage? What is the thing that we do with the lowest opportunity cost? And luckily, in the modern era, we don't have to guess. We have a mathematical tool to figure it out. It is the direct descendant of David Ricardo's math, and it's called the location quotient, or LQ. If you're an economic developer and you are not using location quotients to drive your strategy, you're flying blind. Let me give you a mini masterclass right here on how to use it. So location quotient is simply a ratio. It compares the concentration of a specific industry in your local region to the concentration of that exact same industry on a national level. Here's the formula. It's simple division. First, you take the percentage of your local workforce that is employed in a specific industry. Let's call it industry X. Then you divide that by the percentage of the national workforce employed in industry X. The number you get at the end is your location quotient. And the way you read it is the secret to building your regional strategy. If your location quotient is less than 1, say 0.5, it means your region has a lower concentration of that industry than the national average. You are not meeting your local needs. You're importing those goods or services. You do not have a comparative advantage here. If your LQ is exactly 1, it means your local employment perfectly matches the national average. You are meeting your local demand, but you aren't really an exporter. But if your LQ is greater than 1, and specifically if it's 1.2 or higher, you have struck gold. That means your region has a significantly higher concentration of that industry than the rest of the country. You are an exporter. You have a specialized workforce. You have an established supply chain. This is your comparative advantage. Let's walk through a hypothetical real-world example. Let's say you are the economic development director for a mid-sized region in Ohio. The mayor comes to you and says, we need to attract a massive software engineering headquarters. Software is the future. Let's offer $100 million in incentives to steal a tech company from Austin. Before you write that check, you run the LQ. You look at your data. In your Ohio region, maybe only 1% of your total workforce is employed in software engineering. But nationally, let's say 4% of the workforce is in software. 1 divided by 4 is 0.25. Your LQ for software is 0.25. You go back to the mayor and say, Mayor, we have absolutely no comparative advantage in software. If we try to attract a tech headquarters, we are fighting a losing battle against regions that already have the talent. We are wasting the taxpayers' money. But then you keep running the data. You look at advanced manufacturing, specifically aerospace parts manufacturing. You find that in your Ohio region, 10% of your entire workforce is employed in making aerospace parts. Nationally, only 2% of the workforce does that. 10 divided by 2 is 5. Your location quotient for aerospace manufacturing is a massive 5.0. That concentration is 5 times the national average. That is your English cloth. That is your Portuguese wine. You don't chase the tech headquarters. You double down on aerospace. You align your local community college to create custom training programs for CNC machining and aerospace engineering. You prep your industrial megasites specifically for heavy manufacturing power loads. You tailor your incentive packages to help your existing aerospace companies expand and buy new equipment. You specialize. You divide the labor. You build an ecosystem so deeply rooted and highly productive that site selectors have no choice but to put your region on their shortlist when an aerospace project comes across their desk. Adam Smith and David Ricardo took a world obsessed with state power, extraction, and zero-sum border wars, and they tore it down. They replaced it with a framework of positive-sum growth. They proved that through specialization and trade, we don't have to fight over the exact same slice of pie. We can build a bigger bakery. The classical revolution proved that the ultimate goal of the economy is the welfare of the consumer, not the vanity of the politician. It is a lesson that took the world 200 years to learn, and it's one we have to remind ourselves of every single day in the economic development profession. Join us next time for episode 5, as we leave the elegant mathematical models of the Enlightenment behind and watch what happens when these theories violently collide with the soot, the steel, and the brutal world-altering reality of the Industrial Revolution. I'm Devin Hillsdon-Smith. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Architects of Prosperity. And remember, no matter how complex the location quotient gets, site selectors are people too. See ya. Just a heads up, views expressed in this podcast are solely my own and are not attributable to any employers, whether past or present. Thank you.